I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. I am your host, David Agranoff. If you are new to this podcast, I cover science fiction and horror, and I'm in the middle of a series on the Science Fiction Hall of Fame short stories. And our next episode will be covering Only a Mother by Judith Merrill with Professor Patrick Sharp from Cal State LA and Audrey Taylor of Pueblo State, Colorado, Colorado State Pueblo. I can speak. And those are our guests with Judith Merrill. But if you're new to this podcast, if you're just finding us because you're looking for Ray Nayler content, please check the archives. I think you'll find all kinds of stuff. Plus, this is the third time Ray's been on the show. So if you have not seen his interview about Tusks of Extinction and Mountain in the Sea, I highly recommend you go back because all that background stuff on who Ray is and how he got here, I already did all that stuff. So you're going to have to go find those episodes for that. Welcome back, Ray. Third time's a charm. We're here to talk about Where the Axe is Buried.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah. I'm very excited to talk about this book, and we'll get to it in a little tiny bit. But and I was very thankful to get a chance to read an early copy. This is a hardcover release, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, because and I prefer paperback, so I guess I'm glad to get an ARC. But we'll get to Where the Axe is Buried in a minute. But as I did last time, I'm kind of interested to see if the conversation around Mountain in the Sea has shifted again, because it's one of the funny things about the Mountain in the Sea, your debut novel, which, by the way, 2 years ago, or maybe 2023, was my top read of the year. And so I did not read Where the Axe is Buried till 2025 started. So, but it would have been high on my list if I had read it last year. But one of the things about Mountain in the Sea is the conversation kind of shifts. Have you seen any shifts in the conversation of Mountain in the Sea recently?
Yeah, it's been interesting. Actually, I think that the Mountain and the Sea conversation seems to have settled into the this is like 90% a book about AI
Right.
and maybe 10% a book about octopuses. And I was just at the Silicon Valley Reads Festival last month. I guess it's not even last month. It's like the beginning of this month. I've been traveling too much. Like my brain is fried. But I was up there talking about it, and they specifically invited me because it was, AI was their focus. Um, and I felt like it was a little bit awkward. I was scared at first because I felt like I might be the only person there who was like, AI might not be great. Because
Right.
it sounded very it sounded very optimistic. But in fact, the panel I was on, people were talking about the pluses and minuses of things. It was a little more nuanced. But yeah, I feel like the conversation has stuck around there somewhere. Like it shifted from octopus to AI a couple months after the book came out, and it's pretty much stayed around AI. But I think that AI has also somehow remained like front and center,
Oh, totally.
a couple of
Yeah.
years now, right? Like it's kind of January 2023. So
Yeah, the funny thing is with Mountain in the Sea, I'm Team Octopus,
yeah,
um, being the leading part of the discussion. I think the AI part of it is important.
yeah,
Um, and far be it from me to not want to discuss AI because as a PKD guy, like I just did a whole workshop on second variety and the whole robots exploiting empathy aspect of that. And
Mhm.
so I am interested in the topics of AI, but the octopus stuff is more what really interested me about Mountain in the Sea. So I'm Team Octopus on that.
Yeah, and I'm kind of team octopus too, to tell you the truth. I mean, without the octopus, there never would have been a book, right? And then
Right.
the other stuff was sort of there. The way I kind of put it was like all the other AI stuff is sort of just there to shine lights back on the octopus. Like that's all there is like foils of some kind, right? Like I'm building like a system that's focused on alien minds, and all the AI stuff is kind of secondary for me to the central figure, which is the
Yeah.
octopus and trying to communicate with it.
Well, that's kind of like the parallel track of the book is, looking at how we understand artificial intelligence versus how we understand this, natural intelligence
Yeah.
that, that we fail to understand, even though it's been around us for eternity, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's one of the interesting questions about Mountain in the Sea, and one of the things that makes it great. We are going to we will dive a little tiny bit into some spoilers of this book towards the back end of this conversation. We will give people plenty of warning. We will try to stay as general as possible early. Um, but the only other question I have about the first two books, which everyone should know, I am a massive fan of Mountain in the Sea and Tusks of Extinction, the novella that you put out in between these two novels. And but what makes this one very different from those two is those two are very kind of ecologically minded and have like
Mhm.
kind of an ecological center, whereas this book has more of a political angle to it. Was that an intentional shift or something that kind of accidentally happened as the idea came to you for this book?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I've always said
Not that
that
there's not ecological issues in this book too.
right, yeah. And I mean it's all sort of there, but it's kind of like um the best way I could sort of put it is it's a little bit like in the Mountain and the Sea, the lens was focused on the ecological and the animal intelligence stuff. And in the background, there was all this political stuff. And I always felt like I wanted to kind of get back to that,
Yeah,
the world structure and the way that governments were working and all those things. And this is like kind of a zooming in on that stuff, which is not to say that it's related to the Mountain and the Sea and it's the
yeah,
same world or anything. But that's always been a big part of my writing and my interests, and I hadn't yet written about it. So it's kind of this was my chance to dive into that. And I've always sort of said like if you looked at my work, if you kind of drilled through everything that I've written and extracted like an ice core from it all from beginning to end, you'd have a pretty good sense of like my interests and how they've grown and changed over the years and like how, densely packed in one area like political interests or environmental interests are. And this is just, you know, um, it's like one of those things people forget that if The Mountain and the Sea came out October of 2022, that also means I finished writing The Mountain and the Sea at like the end of 2019, you
right.
know, or like early 2020. So I'm 5 years away from that thought process that gave birth to that novel. And then Tusks of Extinction was written immediately after The Mountain and the Sea and actually was finished before The Mountain and the Sea ever came out,
Yeah,
right? So I've had years of separation from those two books, and they seem a lot further away to me than they do to readers, right? Just because of the way the publishing schedule works. But yeah, right now, for the last few years, my interests have been sort of in systems, which extends from my interest in systems, Mountain and the Sea and Tusks, but these, in this case, more like political and human systems than animal systems. Although I feel like, again, Mountain and the Sea was a super political book in some ways, right? And then this book still has the biology and the ecology in there somewhere. It's more about where the lens is focused, right?
Right. And being that I've had two conversations with you on the podcast, I'm going to go into this book reading it with a little bit more knowledge than maybe
Sure.
some readers. But I immediately picked up on the fact that, um, and a lot of people will um, probably sense the wrong oligarchy. uh, but I immediately caught on that this is mostly commentary on Putin,
Mm,
um, and Putin's Russia. And now it's there because of the geography of the federation that exists in this book. And we'll get into more details eventually, but um, where did the original, and I know this is sometimes hard for writers to nail down exactly where the original inspiration was, but what kind of like lit the fuse for where the axe is buried?
well, interestingly enough, I think what really lit the fuse for that, the sort of, the two halves of the book, right? There's the kind of Western part and there's the, let's say, Eastern part. And what really lit a fuse for me for the Eastern part was not anything particularly related to the Russian Federation. It was actually related to the genocide being directed at the Uyghurs in in Western China. And I had read this book about all of the technology that was being used to surveil and sort of erode their cultural presence and the facial recognition that was being used and all of these things. And so a lot of the ideas for that empire, for the Federation, actually came out of that. So a lot of the technology and things like that. And then also, in my work in Azerbaijan, which was as its own authoritarian state, I had seen a lot more surveillance technology being used against journalists and websites and my fascination sort of started there, and I started thinking a lot about surveillance and data processing and the kind of cages that get constructed from data, and then relating that to some real world issues and kind of moving the focus to a different place. So it's like a combination of a lot of things, right? Um, Certainly, my wife is from Russia. The Russian is my second language, and I spent a lot of time there and in the republics of the Soviet Union. Um, but I would say also that the book isn't really about him or
Okay.
that place. And there's a reason why I never use the word Russia in the book. And that's really because I don't intend fully for people to make that parallel. I mean, I know it's there,
Right.
right? But I don't want to limit their mind to that because it's not meant to be a one-to-one parallel. It's really meant to be more open than that. And I want people to sort of look at surveillance systems and their effect on freedom and the effect that surveillance and the system of governance has as a sort of larger and less um, place-oriented issue, if that makes sense, right? I don't want them to feel like, okay, this is there and I don't have to worry about it. Right. And that's why I took away some of the names in a sense, and I tried to give this book a more general context.
Right. Well, and also Russian being your second language also went led to the greatest humble brag that I've ever had on the podcast was when you said that you read Stanislaw Lem in Russian because you want to read it as close to its original language, and I was like, damn, that is a great brag. That is a great humble brag. I love that because
Oh,
it's so nerdy
oh,
too. But
so nerdy.
but you know, it's interesting because um, you don't this future that you're kind of setting up, like it's obviously going to have elements of Russia and America and China and all these things into it because you're also setting up this kind of more internationalized future that's
Hmm.
had a couple hundred years of the kind of technology that we have the world kind of splicing together with.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
so that's going to be part of it too. So like it's um, but what I think is great is your international experience. Like if I tried to write um, if I tried to write a novel with this scope or whatever, I still have to rely on my American point of view because I have traveled only a little bit out of
Hmm.
this country, but you have experiences that you bring to your toolbox as a science fiction writer that are really important
Hmm.
for what makes your work your work. So, how do you feel like your international travels and works most affected this particular novel, as opposed
Well, I
to
mean,
I, I can
yeah,
see how it affected the other two books.
yeah. I mean, it's one obvious way would be, in 2003, I left California and I joined the Peace Corps and I moved to Turkmenistan. And Turkmenistan was still under the authoritarian rule of Saparmurat Niyazov, who called himself Turkmenbashi, the head of all Turkmen, and was a completely closed authoritarian state, much like North Korea. There was a um, rotating golden statue of the president in the middle of the capital, which turned to face the sun. The local joke, of course, was that no, it's not the statue that turns to face the sun. It's the sun that turns to face the statue, right?
Uh,
And and it was a brutal authoritarian rule, like total dictatorship. It was a bit comic for people, and the butt of a lot of jokes in the United States, but for the people living in Turkmenistan, it was certainly not funny at all. And I still don't find it funny, honestly.
right.
Like when people joke about Turkmenistan, because living under it never felt humorous, whatsoever. And it's still an authoritarian state under the son of the president who succeeded Turkmenbashi. And then I went to Moscow and I lived. That was like the first time was what 2005 to 6. Another time I lived in Moscow was like 2007, 2008. So Putin's rise was well on its way. There were repressions in some areas sort of beginning, but it wasn't anything like it has become. Um, and so that was a different phase of authoritarianism. I lived in Kazakhstan, which was another authoritarian state, but one that was run much like a business, where you weren't supposed to feel like it was an authoritarian state. You were sort of felt like, "Oh, I'm pretty much free to do whatever I want as long as I don't bother the government, and talk about those things. I should be okay." Um, I traveled to Afghanistan, which was in the midst of a war at that time, and fighting off the Taliban, and had been, a religious authoritarian state under the Taliban, is again, and and so I have, like, unlike a lot of Americans, right?
Mhm.
I have a lot of experience in living in authoritarian states. I know what they feel like from the inside, and because I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I lived with a host family. I have close contact. I had close contact on a daily basis with people who had lived their whole lives first under the Soviet Union and then under in the Turkmen Republic under Niyazov and his regime, and all they had known was authoritarianism, right? And
Right.
so I know what its rise feels like in Russia as well. I know what its total, concrete, sort of full-blown nature is. I forgot Azerbaijan, another authoritarian state where I served for 2 years. And Kyrgyzstan, which was a former authoritarian state, but then had a democratic revolution and reclaimed their democracy, and now is slipping back into authoritarian stuff. And so, you know, um, that's in a nutshell, right? and that's a pretty big nutshell, I guess. I kind of went on, but that's where it comes from, right? It's a lot of experience with authoritarianism and in its different phases.
Yeah, and so I know some of my listeners are going to want to know if there's some Phil Dickian elements, and I would say the Phil Dick novel that is most similar to what you're doing here is one of the rarer ones. I'm not sure if you've read it. It may be completely accidental, and that is his 1956 novel, The Man Who Japed. Um, yeah, this it was his commentary on Maoist China
Uh-huh.
and
Okay.
surveillance state and those kinds of things. And so it's funny because I didn't even like so few people have read The Man Who Japed that in my besides like very hardcore dickheads. I didn't even make the comparison in my review, but I do feel that there's some elements that are very similar to that novel. So, and it's funny because, and one of those things is the social credit score.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Yeah. So the social credit score is drawn from China's system, actually.
yeah,
President
exactly.
like the real system.
Yeah, and there's a whole thing in the Man Who Japed with like neighborhood meetings and like and all that. And it's interesting because he wrote it in '56. So how much information he had living in Berkeley in 1956,
Right.
I you know I don't know. But the social credit score part of it was the thing that I thought was the most um, Dickian thing. Now Phil would have had the whole novel like start with the person trying to get their score up, and
Right.
so it's a little different for how it relates to your novel, but I really like that it's just a very subtle little world building piece that shows us a little bit about how that part of the world works. And
Yeah.
so I just wanted to bring that up for people who are, for my folks who might be wondering, like, how Dickian is this novel. I think this novel is, I think in general, you seem to be more influenced by Stanislaw Lem. Um, and I don't know that I really feel your hardcore influences on this. I'm not sure because there's a little bit of a cyberpunky thing kind of going on. There's elements that border on that because you're talking about this, but I expected a far future Dune like thing, and that's not what we get. This is definitely our future
Hmm.
um, in this book, and we're a couple hundred years kind of in the future. So there's a lot of speculative allegory going on with this totalitarian federation president. But the cyberpunk aspect of it comes in with Zoya, who very early in the novel, we get this idea that she's this kind of revolutionary character. And Zoya is approached like, hey, we want to digitize um, your writing and your thoughts, and we want to like make you into like a digital creature so you can live on and you can continue to write after your body dies.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, um, I thought Zoya was one of the most interesting character in the book for that reason because she's kind of becoming a writing engine, which is something that a lot of us are fighting as writers, right? Look how much work Paul Tremblay has put into suing AI like engines, and shout out to Paul. But you know, what was what, was she an early part of this story with Zoya, or did she kind of happen into the idea? Did she come into it as you started to develop the world?
I think I'm really interested in this question of whether literature can have an influence on real events. And my answer to that has always been like, it most certainly does, quite often in a very negative sense.
Yeah,
I always, say I wonder how many people the book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion killed,
right.
right? Like if you could charge a book with murder, right?
Yeah,
Like that would certainly be one that I would choose. And And there's many examples, of course, but um, the idea for Zoya as this revolutionary, I mean, first of all, she's kind of this hybrid of many autobiographies and biographies that I read of revolutionaries in history and the revolutionary struggle in general. Like, how do you break a system, right? How do you finally destroy something that has so much more power than you have? And what's the human cost and that kind of thing? And so for me, she's like that sort of representation of like kind of all revolutionaries in one person. And then for me also like this question of like, is it possible to change the world with a book? And that and the book kind of keeps returning, of course, to these passages from her book and the ways that they've inspired other people to act, and the ways that they've been interpreted by the characters and the sort of counterpoints that they show. But one of the other things that I felt is really important about Zoya for me is this idea that um, politics has to be this continuous argument, right? In which we're just fundamentally at odds. There's never going to be a point in which we're not at odds with one another over, what is to be done, like what is the best, way forward. But that being at odds has to be occurring in a space where of freedom, right? Like you can't have that argument in a repressive space. And repressive spaces can take many forms, as I think, where the axe is buried sort of demonstrates.
Well,
But
what's cool
Zoya
about
is this sort of spirit of pure and ongoing argument, right?
right, yeah, and I pointed this out in my review is that I always think of that with Zoya. I kept thinking of that term. You can kill the revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. But now you
Yeah.
can't kill the revolutionary
Right.
because
Right.
uh, she can, she's allowed herself to be digitized, and the book that she was writing was the Forever Argument, and I don't know if that's a little tip of the hat to Joe Handelman or just an accident, but I loved that title, and I think what you're trying to say is that this book is like one that because she will continue forever to create because she can't be killed. Like that's where the
Mhm.
title comes from. I get it, but yeah, it's Zoya is an interesting. Well, and what she does is, and you know, my listeners know I always say that the uh, um, the essence of storytelling is parallels and reversals, and of course the parallel with the Federation president who continually puts himself in a new body, and
Mhm.
so it's where Zoya becomes the foil for the president. But
Mhm.
this president who there's a really great part of this book, and I don't think it's a big spoiler, where he's talking about how amazing it is that he can move from the bodies and look at what we're doing, and the point of view character is like, well, yeah, that's great for you, but you're the only one that gets to do this,
Mhm.
and I'm not getting to do this, and I thought it was such a great highlight for talking about the feelings of the authoritarian leader that only sees like the great wonder and amazingness of what they're doing,
Right.
and what they get, and they're not thinking about what it means for the people.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and so let's talk about this president character. Uh, yeah, he's not a one-to-one to anybody else, right? But
Mhm.
he has elements of many authoritarian leaders. So, he was your chance to talk about these different authoritarian leaders. So you must have felt a little pressure to combine all these elements with this character, right?
I mean, I think that for me, and this is really where, I mean, I grew up also kind of reading Philip K. Dick, and he's one of those writers that kind of became a part of my early DNA. And I feel like, he is a deep influence, and even if he doesn't show up on the surface in many ways, like he's sort of always there. And but one of the things that I really absorbed from him is there's always a way in which in science fiction things are kind of like a joke that you take seriously,
Right.
right? And so, one of the things with authoritarianism is it's always seeking to renew itself and kind of pretend as if it's apologizing for like past wrongs or blame those wrongs on someone else or like shift the blame. And the president sort of being able to literally enter new younger bodies and then have a speech when he comes in replacing himself about the mistakes that this instance of himself from before made and how they're going to be rectified by this new regime, and have this kind of constant rebirth is the dream in many ways of authoritarianism. Like you can just blame the past on someone else, have yourself assassinated, be reborn, and start your authoritarian regime anew, on a nice like new set of legs, right?
Yeah.
And I think, in that sense, what I was kind of trying to show was, and the joke there, right, is aren't they all the same guy in
Yeah.
the end? Like the authoritarian guy, just always like when you really look at what kind of a character, what kind of a personality it makes, it takes to be an authoritarian. It is almost as if like Stalin and Mao and like like they were all cut from the same cloth. They could almost you could almost see them, you know, moving from one body to another, this kind of authoritarian mindset that has so much in common with the authoritarian people that came before. And they're all learning from each other. They all know, they learn from one another's mistakes. I mean, I think a big problem in the world today is that in the, we've built this noosphere, we've built this incredible exchange of data and information, and authoritarian governments are also benefiting from that. They're learning from one another's mistakes and they're perfecting authoritarianism and making it more and more durable, right? And more resilient until it kind of becomes this sort of self-renewing and immortal, force. And that's the world that the people in the book are living in, is where authoritarianism has really perfected its, methods. And then how do you try to cause that system to break down?
Well, right. And another example of where you bring something that um, new to the table, where that's uniquely you, is that within the last couple of years you've been involved with so many conversations about AI. So
Mm,
right, so you've been invited to the Silicon Valley reading, and you've been invited, and I'm sure this was happening before you were writing this book um, already, but this book has some interesting takes on the tech bros and how they're getting involved in this wider situation of society and getting involved in society. So there's this part with the PMs, the
mm,
prime ministers, which are these like, if I'm understanding, remembering correctly, I read this book more than a month ago and I've crammed a lot into my brain since then. But the AI run prime ministers are kind of like the tech bro answer for, they're like, hey, this is this is the smart democracy, right?
right.
That they see this as the smart democracy, and there's like, there's a character, George, and he says, I think the PM is doing what it's designed to do, and another character says, cause a revolution. And he's like, no, we designed it to calculate human needs and deconflict these needs in order to promote human thriving. And so they think like, well, just like how they're like, well, why would you spend all this time writing a book when you could just tell an AI to do it, right? And
Right.
these guys are like, why would you have a democracy when we could just have the PM do the
Right.
democracy for you?
Right. Right.
And I
Right.
love this part of the book, and this is a small part of the book, very small part of the book, but it's one that jumped out to me because I immediately recognized like what you were trying to say about the whole, like, why don't we just computerize democracy? And it was just, you know, I don't know. Was I reading this part correct? Because that's what I saw it commenting on. But
No, I think you nailed it. I mean, I think that one of the one of the one of the things about like those phrases, right? Like we're gonna create a world that's optimized for human thriving, things like that, right? Is like, what's human thriving? It's completely different probably for one person than it is for someone else. Like, what is optimization of like human life? Like, what does that look like? You know, what does it mean to deconflict if people have fundamentally different views on what makes a good world and a good life and a good system, you know, to live under? And I think the sort of tech bro solution thing is extraordinarily misled in this instance, primarily because um, democracy is not supposed to provide a final and oversimplified and optimized solution for anything. It's just supposed to be a process that is continuous and is constantly trying to improve, you know, given that we are highly fallible and can't agree on anything, right? Like we're, you know, it's messy and human and difficult and all of those things. And this whole idea that somehow you could just create some allegedly unbiased system that would just, you know, solve the problem as if it was math, right? Is absurd. The more you think about it, the weirder the idea gets. And I feel like the idea can only really be held be sort of taken seriously by people who lack the ability to empathize with people who hold fundamentally different points of view
yeah,
and who are so obsessed with technological solutions and over solutions to things, right? That they can't see that some things don't have solutions. Some things just have processes that have to be continuous so that we don't end up shipwrecked on some authoritarian shore somewhere, right? And democracy is one of those things. Like, we're never going to get it right,
yeah,
ever. You know, but it's the only way forward. It's like, you know, it's the only thing that we have is listening to one another. And that's, for me, that's the core of democracy. Democracy is just the ability to listen to the other, right? And to have this continuous conversation about the division of goods and labor and what we're going to protect and how and what's meaningful and what's not. I mean, all of those things are up uh, for interpretation. So yeah, I mean that's definitely you nailed it. It's like commentary on the whole concept of having some way, some optimization, and then the whole concept that
oh
like
no, no,
there's
no,
anything like
you
not
nailed
building a
it because you wrote the book and I
yeah.
just I'm just
Like,
reading it.
I mean, you definitely got it. Like it's you know the whole idea that AI wouldn't have bias, right? When it's
Right.
you know these are fundamentally tools that are built out of the analysis of data scraped from the World Wide Web and
Yeah, there was that famous case where that one chatbot got super racist. Like, right.
right, right. I mean, and of course it would because like there's just like the web is super racist and
Yeah,
horrible and biased and weird and incomplete and you know filled with bizarre theories. I mean, all of that stuff is there. But then just beyond that, if you even took that away, you can't build anything that doesn't come with biases.
right.
And you know, there's one point at which you know I think it's Palmer says in the book. By the way, speaking of
Yes, I
references.
got it. I got it. Yeah.
So,
It's my
but
favorite PKD novel. Of course, I
yeah,
need to know.
So Palmer says, you know, that you know each PM is customized to the life ways of you know the country that it's leading. And you know, Palmer says like, you know, maybe that's the problem. Like maybe our life ways are just shit,
Yeah,
right? Like that's you know the stuff that's gone into the machine is shit. So all you're gonna get out of it is shit, you know?
right. Well, and another, you know, and I want to be cautious of of all of our time today. But there's one other aspect that I thought was really, really, really powerful part that I want to highlight, which is, and I'll read it. That's how it was. One day you had your own country. The next day you were a refugee. You were in line waiting to be someone again, to be legal again, not to be nothing. And um, kind of the consequence of this, like government by cold equations, as to use
Mm,
another sci-fi
good one.
callback. You know, this whole idea that you could be a refugee just one day to the next. This is a thing that in some of the countries that you spend time in, people experienced, but
Yeah.
um, it's also something that is very worrying to those of us who with the way times are changing now,
Yeah.
and like we have to you know have to worry about these things, and it's good for this novel to be putting this question out there, that you know to show an example of, in an authoritarian state, you know uh, that could happen very quickly. You
Yeah.
could go from having status to not having status. you know uh,
Yeah, and I mean, I think that this is something that is in a bit of an obsession of mine, and I think it goes through all three of the books when I think back about it. It's the idea that, as human beings, we live in these constructs, and we don't realize, I think, how fragile the constructs that we're living in really are. We build these castles in the air. We have these systems. We have checks and balances. We have laws, and we have all of these things. Um, but fundamentally, they're made of nothing at all.
yeah,
They're made of some kind of set of agreements that we have, some kind of common illusion in some sense that we've turned into a reality, that there's a certain way to structure the world, and we're going to agree to have it structured that way, and that agreement becomes a nation eventually, and that comes to be a place where you live and it feels really stable, and where but then one day it can disappear, and that has happened. I mean, it's amazing to me to think, right, that there are people, for example, who, because of the span of their lives, lived entirely within the Soviet Union, right?
yeah,
They were born like some period after 1917, and they died before 1991.
yeah,
And for the entirety of their childhoods, their careers, etc., their reality was the reality of the Soviet Union, right?
yeah,
And when you look back on that, it almost seems like an alternate universe now, right?
yeah.
Like they would have believed a completely different set of things. They would have had this totally different view of how the world was structured, of who the United States was, all of those things. And the Soviet Union seemed immortal.
Yeah.
Everyone
I,
who was living in it thought so, and the CIA thought so,
yeah.
and we thought so. All of our best analysts thought it would be around forever. And then, like a soap bubble, it burst and was gone.
You might be interested in this, is that one of my heroes in science fiction, and a good friend and mentor of mine, John Shirley, he wrote a novel in the 70s called Transmaniacon. And the Soviet Union played a big role in like parts of it. And a couple of years ago, he was working on a new paperback edition, and he
Uh-huh.
wanted to update it and take all the references to the Soviet Union out. And I got into a huge argument with him about
Uh-huh.
no, you gotta leave it, you gotta leave it. And then and we talked about how the invincibility of the Soviet Union is a part of the science fiction of the era,
Right.
and
Right.
I appreciate when I see references to a future Soviet Union in out of date science fiction. And I personally, I think I lost that argument. I think he went ahead and updated it,
Uh-huh.
but I really tried to influence him to maintain that stuff, and I forever have my paperback from 1978. So,
Yeah.
um, you know, it will always have that. But it's interesting how you say that with the bubble bursting and how it just changed everything. It's
Yeah.
very cool.
It's
Now,
like,
I read a book right after I read Where the Axe is Buried that was written in 1908, and they made a very interesting pairing.
hmm,
Um, I'm wondering if you have ever read Jack London's The Iron Heel. Um,
no, that is not a Jack London that I have read. Like I think I'm familiar with it conceptually.
yeah, it's one of his science fiction novels. Yeah.
Yeah. But I haven't read it. And I don't think I'm not sure I've read any of his science fiction stuff. Um,
Oh, you must read The Iron Heel. You must.
yeah,
And
I'll put it on my list. My
yeah,
list does go out beyond the heat death of the universe, but I'll put it on there and try to move it up somewhere near the top.
well, just because I think it has a lot of similarities with Where the Axe is Buried.
Uh-huh.
And I just wrote a column on the Iron Heel for Amazing Stories for my column, 25th Century Five and Dime, and in that because it's written as a it was written in 1908, and it's about proletariat uprising in 1913, but it has all these footnotes that Jack London was writing as if it was a historian from 500 years in the future.
Ah. Oh, that's cool. I like that idea.
Yeah, doing footnotes about it. So all the most science fictional aspects are actually in the footnotes.
Uh-huh.
Um, but it's a proletariat uprising against the oligarchy. And
Uh-huh.
it's interesting because there's a whole like riot in Chicago that has like hot air balloon attacks, and because it was 1913 or
Oh, that sounds
1908
great.
when it was happening.
That's so like steampunk too. That's kind of awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very cool, but it was interesting because I was reading it because I've been reading a book about colonialism and science fiction from the 19th century. And even though this was written in the 20th century, early in the 20th century, Iron Heel was mentioned in it. And it just happened to come up in my library queue
Uh-huh.
right around the time that I got this in the mail. So I ended
Uh-huh.
up reading them back to back. And my edition of the Iron Heel actually went really hard. It had an introduction from Trotsky, which was,
Oh wow, that does go hard.
yeah, it went very hard. And so it was a really interesting experience reading Where the Axe is Buried, which is a modern science fiction novel, with
Oh,
this one from 1908, which both deal with um, oligarchies, but yours was all high tech and had all the things that
yeah.
a modern person would write. And so it was very interesting to read them back to back. And so I would
Interesting.
also put this out. The reason why I brought it up here, when you know, is that I think it's a good pairing for the listeners, also to look at this um, comparison because it really says a lot about I think where science fiction has come from. When Jack London wrote that, science fiction wasn't even a term yet because we're coming
Right.
up next year on the 100th anniversary of the term science fiction.
Right.
So science fiction wasn't even a thing when he wrote it, and it's just makes such a great comparison. And I know that's really high, putting you in the same breath with Jack London, but I think you earned it, sir. I think you earned it because I
Well,
read these two
thank
books
you.
back to back, and I felt that way.
I mean, I feel like I was just when I was in Silicon Valley Reads, one of the things that I found myself talking about was that I really think that science fiction is always about its own time. And and I think that's one of the things that gets lost in quite often in the way that people talk about the genre because futurism and the futuristic kind of aspects of science fiction are accented, especially in conversations that one has externally about science fiction, right? Like not within the genre and with like big fans of the genre as much as, outside of the genre and the perceptions of it. But for the reason I would have kept the Soviet Union and it confuses me to get rid of it, right? Like
Yeah,
in the book that you mentioned was that it was a book about that. And
yeah,
and it's not something to be like for me, I mean, I'm sure you've read what I've written about like prediction versus predication. But like,
Yeah.
for me, like science fiction just predicates a different world in
Yeah.
order to shine a light on the world that exists. It doesn't predict, a possible future. And I always get you get these questions as a science fiction writer, like, oh, how far in the future do you think it'll be before it's possible to build, Evrim? And I'm like, uh, that's never going to happen. Like, that's
Yeah.
fake. That's just like, that's just pretend. Like, I'm like,
Right.
it's,
Well, the example I always use is how mad that Phil got when Don Wilhelm said on Martian Time Slip, there's no way we're going to have a Mars colony by 1994. Said it in 2094. And he was like, fuck you, in my 1994, there's a Mars colony.
right, right.
And he pulled it from Ace and actually published it with Valentine because he didn't want to change it.
Uh-huh.
Um, and because Wolheim, it messed with Wolheim's science fiction sensibilities, but
Right.
For Phil, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
Didn't matter
And
at all.
I'm much more, so I know it's like I'm a little bit odd, right? Because I like the hard sci-fi stuff. I like that as like elements in the mountain and the sea. I
Yeah,
like those real science issues. I like really taking ideas seriously. I like trying to be knowledgeable about the latest technology. I like the accuracy elements and all those things. But at the same time, I'm totally willing to have things that are just improbable, impossible, whatever. Um, because I feel like usually they just function as thought experiments
yeah,
so that I can think about philosophical issues. Like I'm not, I really do believe we'll never create a conscious anything. And but that's just a belief. I mean, we don't know, right?
yeah,
But that it's just as unjustifiable as people who believe we will, right? It's a matter of faith. But my faith, my intuition, whatever you want to call it, tells me these things are not possible. That doesn't stop me from writing about them. I
yeah,
also don't think that you can copy the human connectome or that we will be able to at any time in the future and like download or upload minds. But it's an interesting and inviting concept because it gives us this way of talking about mind and creating situations that would be impossible if we didn't make those things up. And for me, that's predication. And that's what's amazing about science fiction. It's this all of those crazy instruments that you can build to take apart and rearrange the world and take a closer
absolutely.
look at different elements of it. I feel like that's what made, I mean, Philip K. Dick is great at that, right? Like it's
Yeah,
always, I mean, an instrument to take apart and look at the mind and psychology and and the present moment. Um, it's hard to explain to people outside the genre that like Blade Runner is not a movie about androids,
yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Like this
Well,
is
in
or
Peter,
Blade Runner might be a movie a little bit about androids. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is not a book about androids.
no,
It's a book
it's
about what it means
philosophy.
to be human and empathetic and like so many other things,
Yeah,
right? And like many other things. But it's certainly not, you know, um, it's not obsessed with predicting some kind of a future, right?
absolutely not. And you reminded me of the Peter Straub had a quote, the horror writer Peter Straub, where he said, "I don't believe in ghosts, but my imagination does."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's a perfect way. That's a great way of putting it, right? Like it's, you know, um, and I'd say like it's just for me, science fiction is a combination quite often of hard science and taking problems really seriously and all those things, and also just hocus pocus. We're just like because I can. Like, why is Tibet a technological, power in the mountain and the sea? Like, because I can make it so, and I
Yeah.
did because I think it's really interesting, right? Like,
So Ray, Where the Axe is Buried comes out April 1st.
yes,
Um, uh, Very excited about the release of this book, but people can pre-order it now, and you
please do.
should um, pre-order it and make sure you get it right away. Obviously, I'm a huge fan, and I think um, my listeners will really enjoy it. I have This was one of those arcs that when I posted that I got it, I had a couple people seething with jealousy and telling me um, that I should really appreciate that I got this one, and I did. I really did appreciate it. It's a great book.
Man.
Is there anything else you want to announce? Any upcoming appearances or things that you want to promote?
Oh well, I will be on the West Coast. I think it's the 10th it's April 10th in San Francisco at City Lights, and that is sponsored by Locus magazine. And
Nice.
then I'll be at Powell's the next day, April 11th, up in Portland.
Oh, very cool.
So
I have a lot of friends in Portland. I'm going to make
oh,
sure.
awesome. Yeah. So those two things, I won't probably get down to Southern California, unfortunately. But I'll also be here on the 1st at Lost City Books in DC, and then on, I think it's the 4th at the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore.
Well, if you ever are in San Diego and you do Mysterious Galaxies, I have um, interviewed authors for events before there. I would
Oh man,
recommend.
I'd love to do that. That'd be great. Do this in
Yeah,
person.
Mysterious Galaxies, great bookstore, and another place where you can pre-order this book. I checked on their website. You can
Awesome.
pre-order it there already. Oh, we also have a great bookstore in Encinitas, up in northern San Diego, called Artifact Books, that does great events. And I need to shout out Artifact because if you want any signed copies of my books, you can order them through. There's a lot of Last Night to Kill Nazis signed at Artifact. So,
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Yeah, and I
yeah,
should actually mention too, if you want a signed copy of Where the Axe is Buried, if you pre-order from Lost City Books in DC, I can sign and personalize books there. I just walk down to the store and I'll write a
Lost
personal.
City Books.
Yeah, Lost City Books.
All right, let's shout out and yeah, this was a great conversation, Ray, as always. I
Thank
hope to do it
you.
for the next one. Do you have one already completed, or are you working on one?
I'm working on it.
Working.
I'm well on my way. I think I just crossed the 60,000 word line this week. So it's coming along.
Yeah, I know the speculative fiction across media conference in LA next year is on AI and alternate realities, and I have already been we've been talking about Mountain in the Sea and how I hope that there's a whole bunch of papers on Mountain in the Sea at that conference. So I'm doing Phil, of course, but
Yeah.
I
Awesome.
gotta stay in my wheelhouse. But
Yeah. Nice.
yeah, and shout out to that conference for people. First year last year was a great conference. Academics, science fiction academics from all over the world. It was really cool conference. So
Oh yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
yeah. So on that note, Ray will hopefully send a lot of people to City Lights. Or was did I get it right?
Lost City for the signed copies, City
City
Lights.
Lights for the signing in San Francisco.
Yeah, for the signing in
And
San
Powell's.
Francisco.
What do you know the dates on those?
I think City Lights is the 10th of April. Is it Thursday, the 10th of April? That sounds right to me. And I will double check just to make sure. April, yes, Thursday, the 10th of April. And then Powell's is the 11th of April. Lost City is the 1st of April here in DC. And the Enoch Pratt Library, I want to say, is actually Tuesday, the 8th of April.
Nice. All right,
Yeah.
lots of fun events.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I uh, I have other thoughts for ways we can promote this book in the future too. I will save those for offline. But
Awesome.
on that note, folks, please come back next week for Only a Mother by Judith Merrill from the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. We got a really exciting one after that one. We're going to be doing Cordwainer Smith. So very exciting stuff. An author you have a lot in common with because he was an international State Department guy who wrote
Yeah.
science fiction. So,
Right.
yeah, interesting dude. So I'm looking forward to that episode. On that note, folks, please like and subscribe and do all that stuff. I'm really bad at asking you to do that stuff, but if you could, it always helps all that algorithmic fun. So on that note, we'll see folks next time.